Good morning and welcome to day 2 of TT19. I hope everybody had great discussions yesterday at the reception. Certainly the volume level in that room indicated that there was a lot of very lively exchange going on, and I hope you all also had a good evening. We move on now to the 4th plenary of TT19, and it is entitled Some for All and New Mobility Efficiency and Green. And if you remember, yesterday's final plenary was dedicated to the safety and access pillars of the Some for All initiative. And this morning we want to pick up where we left off and build our discussion around the 2 other pillars, which are green and efficient. And we'll be asking how new mobility technologies and new business models can help promote the efficiency and the low carbon qualities of the transport sector. We'll also be asking about trade-offs and synergies that policymakers and industry need to address to create enabling environments for transport innovations that can promote clean, competitive economies. How can data-driven innovation be applied to influence demand and passenger behavior in order to manage mobility for an optimal efficiency impact? Those are a couple of the questions that we'll be addressing. And we're going to take a particularly close look at freight in this panel. For one thing, because new technologies that allow greater tracking and reliability are making it an even more important contributor to economic growth. As you probably know, freight volumes are exploding as a result of the globalization of supply chains and the rise in e-commerce. But also we're going to be taking that focus on freight because of its potential contribution to decarbonization, to put it in a positive light. In the World Bank's member countries, freight currently accounts for nearly half of transport's overall share of 15% of global CO2 emissions. So we'll be asking how new mobility technologies might help reduce that. So that's what's in store. And to get us started, I want to put a couple of questions to you once again, dear audience. So please get out your phones or your tablets and go to the following website. I'm hoping you're already on Wi-Fi. And you're going to be going to that same website that we had yesterday for our audience polls, and it is this, Polls EV, as in E for Emily and V for Victor, .com/TT19. See it up there at the upper left of that screen. And you will see this question: can technology solve the efficiency challenge? Yes, AI will rule the world, partially with conditions. Clearly that's the answer for the moderate realists. And then number 3, not in my country. So a lot of moderate realists in this room, clearly. We will now move on to our second audience question, and we've framed it similarly, and it is this: can technology solve the green challenge? Yes, electric vehicles are the future, maybe with conditions, and no, we are doomed. Always got to have one for the pessimists. So again, those who say the conditions are crucial are the majority here, and that gives us a lot to talk about on the panel, of course, because the conditions are exactly what we want to discuss. So let's see what our keynote speaker makes of these responses and what else he has to tell us about new mobility, efficiency, and green. It is a pleasure to hand over the stage to an award-winning urban designer who's known for his new approaches to urban revitalization, suburban growth, and regional planning. His concept of transit-oriented development laid the foundation for policies and city plans that are in use throughout the world. He's taught at numerous leading academic institutions. Please welcome the CEO of Calthorpe Associates, Peter Calthorpe.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to try to be quick here. lot to cover. Yesterday, we just touched on land use. There is no such thing as green transit or transportation without green cities, without green urbanism. And the two are interlocked in ways that I think we're all aware of. But I think we can make always a more powerful case for better transit when it's put in the context of urban form and land use. And one bit of technology I want to talk about is the technology to do better planning. The other one is what I think will be the next generation of transit. Globally, I've been flashing through things here. Globally, what we have in our urban landscapes is sprawl. Different types of sprawl, high-density sprawl, low-density sprawl, low-income sprawl, but all of it is sprawl. All of it disconnects people from each other, from their destinations, from nature. And it grows at different rates in different places, but it is what dominates us. And unless we begin to address that fundamental armature, I don't think transit systems are going to be more than Band-Aids or safety nets for the poor. And it must go way beyond that if we are to save the planet. Now, low-income sprawl, of course, is where most of development will be happening across the planet in the next 30 years. That's where, as people migrate from rural poverty to the opportunities of cities, they end up at the periphery. This is a picture in Mexico City where we got to do a regional plan with the sponsorship of the World Bank and with Centro Mario Molino. And of course, I think we're all familiar with the results of the urban form there, which of course is transportation chaos. And it's driven by things like this. The above picture is social housing, sponsored by the government, a good thing, but always on cheap land at the periphery. And below, of course, is informal settlements, equally at the periphery, disadvantaging the poor because they have very little access to the major job centers. We have tools now that enable us to look comprehensively. And I believe only when we look comprehensively at urban form will we have a chance to solve multiple problems simultaneously, which economically and politically are really the only way to address the challenges in front of us. Urban Footprint was a tool that was developed by the state of California to enhance land use planning, and we've now used it for the World Bank in various places around the country. It has the attribute of combining all the data and information that people need to understand about the built environment and the natural environment and the social and economic environment with the possibility of shaping scenarios, different visions of the futures, and then most importantly, actually to analyze the outcomes across a whole range of metrics, social, economic, and environmental. In a way, it connects the dots. We all live in various dots here, or stovepipes. And what connects them all, of course, is urban form. And that potential synergy is what gives us the greatest potential for real change. Now, here's Mexico City, and the income distribution generally, you can see, is at the periphery. Of the 20 million people in Mexico City, half of them live at the edge, and they are the low-income population. Meanwhile, unlike many North American cities that decentralize jobs, the job centers, the economic opportunity, the cultural resources are all at the center of the city. And that's, of course, where the wealthy live. And so this economic segregation at a regional scale is really at the heart of the challenge. Now, it also means that the low-income population in Mexico City has up to 3 hours of commuting to do every day because the transit systems are dysfunctional and, of course, the distances are greatest. With things like Footprint, we can actually map the city according to just about any criteria. Here it is, access to jobs either by proximity or by high-quality transit. And it turns out that we find that over 2/3 of the population has neither, has no decent access to jobs. And that, along with water and air quality issues, really drives the decision-making around Mexico City. So it's very important when we think about transit to think about it married up with solving the other problems, the land use, affordability, affordable housing, water consumption, energy consumption, air quality. These are all interdependent. And being able to show that coherently, I think, is one of the most important technological innovations we have at our fingertips today. These are some of the metrics that we get to do with urban footprint. Here is a typical scenario analysis. There are 3 options: trend, moderate, and vision. Neutrally named, not to be biased about it at all. And then they vary according to where development happens, sprawl or infill, how much we attain a jobs housing balance in sub-districts, in 30-minute commute zones, what kind of transit investment we make, and what is the urban form. And by combining those into comprehensive scenarios, we can then do analytics like this, which I don't expect you to go through at all, but you get to see where the arrows line up. Travel time, average travel time comes down by 1 hour on commutes. VMT comes down. Water consumption comes down. Energy consumption comes down. So this is all by way of saying that we have these analytical tools now. We should put them to good use to make sure that when we make the case for the next generation of transit, the benefits are calculated across the board. Now, in the United States, I'm particularly interested in this question of AV, and I notice that everybody thinks it's, with conditions, the answer. I think it's not the answer. I think it's a new lease on life for middle-class sprawl. I think it's an opportunity for the middle class and the wealthy to live farther away and not pay with time or effort to get there. It's also a technology that will bleed VMT. All we talk about is that it's going to reduce the number of vehicles. The real issue is the number of vehicle miles traveled. And of course, with the deadheads, and as Robin Chase says, the zero occupant vehicle syndrome, empty trips, in all uses, it increases VMT. And VMT is energy, VMT is asphalt, VMT is congestion, and VMT is a diminution of accessibility. So these are just aggregate studies, but most studies now show privately owned, there's going to be more miles, greater distances. People will send their car to cheap parking lots farther and farther away, back and forth, all sorts of ZOV trips. The shared occupant, say Uber, is not much better because of all the deadheads. And the worst case is if those Uber vehicles without drivers are so convenient that people tend to use them by themselves. And you have single occupant vehicles going in one direction. And so that could lead to a doubling in VMT. This is not the answer we're looking for by any stretch of the imagination. The answer is transit. We talked all the time yesterday about backbone transit really being at the heart of a city's form and opportunity for mobility. And then the last mile issue comes in with all sorts of innovative technology. But what's fascinating to me is we got to get to the last mile. The people who live in the informal settlements at the edge of Mexico City, they're not dealing with the last mile, they're dealing with the last 20 miles in order to get to where they're going. And this is what we need. So we need ubiquitous transit. Now, BRT has emerged in the last 20 years as the most cost-effective means of putting transit in place. And I believe over rail and many other forms, it is the best. I also believe that the new AV technology, when applied to BRT, can take it to the next level. Here in China, we already have autonomous buses running and being deployed. We've done a lot of work in China over the last many years, 10 years, to try to talk about how to get rid of super blocks and isolated land uses and arterials that range from 8 to 12 lanes everywhere. And the answer, of course, is small blocks, mixed use, and transit. The new standards in China are now at least pointing at an auto-free street every kilometer. When less than 30% of the population own cars, why should 100% of the streets be available to cars? Why not make some streets available just to transit, bikes, and pedestrians? Now, these are old ideas. Curitiba did this many, many years ago. I mean, so it's not like we're reinventing the wheel here. We're just saying its time has come. Now, there is a big difference between the standard bus size and the small, agile AV buses. And the difference is express service, skip stop. When you have a large bus with a large number of people, no matter how hard you try, you're going to be stopping at every station, and that slows the transit network. If you had, because we have the technology now, small buses that could organize riders into groups that are all headed to the same direction, those minibuses can then go direct to destination, and we get the advantage of most trips being express trips. And they also have the intelligence, believe it or not, to pass the station in the oncoming lane, because they can talk to the other vehicles. And so we don't need extra widening every time we want to be able to run two directions. Now, this stuff is still funky. It's, I've ridden on these. I don't know how many of you have. And they just, you know, they really are just a big golf cart at this point. But, you know, when I see the amount of money that the private sector is putting into making these things intelligent, I don't think we have to dream very far to think of how it could enhance transit. If we could take BRT and reduce operating costs and increase average speeds, we have transit that really is next generation. So we've always had this kind of vision in the United States. This is what we've got: Strip, 77, Sunset Strip. We think transit is the answer, and we think infill is the answer. The problem with that sequence is that light rail is too expensive. $25 million a mile and up now, depending on where you are. It's just not affordable enough to be ubiquitous, and it's certainly not affordable for most of the developing world. But in California, we've shifted, and we've said our cities now are going to grow around transit. And because of new legislation, we have green plans. Los Angeles voted in $400 billion for new transit. In 2008, it started in the midst of the recession. People said, no more money for highways. We're investing in transit. There's $0 in the RTP for new highways, no new highways. And the structure looks like this. That's the light rail line. Those are extensions. Very expensive, not the best solution. There's the commuter train system, which is a legacy system, which is good, some extensions. But here's the BRT system. And what if that is something I call ART, Autonomous Rapid Transit? You take that old BRT system and you upgrade it with the intelligence that we now have and we allocate to transit system and make it faster and less expensive to run. Now, the less expensive to run, I know, let's acknowledge right now, is a huge problem, because it means that the bus drivers go away. Now, there's going to be security population that has to take care of these systems, but there is going to be attrition, just like in taxis and Uber. There's a shift in where the workforce will end up. But the benefits are so monumental that I think we have to think about this. All right, so let's experiment with this idea in a more concrete venue. How much time do I have? Oh, okay. I'll finish fine. So in the Bay Area, we have a housing crisis. You can see here that we generate jobs, we don't generate housing. That's not quite the same as pushing the poor to the periphery, but it does push the poor to the periphery. People, the average person working in Silicon Valley can't afford to live there by any stretch of the imagination. We did an experiment. We said El Camino Real, the historic avenue that oh, 5 minutes, not a problem. This is the historic street that the Spanish used to settle California. It's been there forever. We said, what if we were to run an ART system down this, because we don't have BART, and we were to examine doing infill and redevelopment along that, as per the picture. This is what El Camino looks like. It's a dump. Right through one of the wealthiest, most innovative places on the planet, the heart of it is parking lots and single-story buildings that are all being put out of business by Amazon. They're no longer economically viable. So with Footprint, we're able to actually identify parcel by parcel what's going on, and we look at where we could add housing without touching any of the existing affordable housing that's along there, and how many acres and how many parcels. And the numbers are stunning. 43 miles. The end result is with only 4-story construction, we can get 250,000 new households. We can solve the housing crisis and the transportation crisis with one idea, which actually repairs the worst urban environment that we've produced over the last 50 years. So that's what El Camino looks like. I know you're in a good place where you can't tell the difference between an office building and a parking structure, which is the way that looks. It's 120 feet. It's, maybe 40 meters wide. It's not a big arterial, but it's a sloppy one. We could very easily fit bikeways and generous sidewalks and a BRT system in that right-of-way. But more interestingly, we could do ART. We could have these small vehicles that are driverless and that actually cluster passengers at the origin and take them direct to destination. And that's what I think is the next generation of affordable transit. If we have transit that reduces cost, here's the ridership numbers. Standard bus, 100%. It's about 11 miles per hour on average, passenger mile. Bus rapid transit, the speed goes up to 18, and ridership increases parallel because it's better. Light rail, the speed is about the same, interestingly, as BRT. There's no advantage over tracks to rubber tire. And the ridership goes up more because people think it's sexier than riding in a bus. But ART, the models show the speed goes up to 23 average miles per passenger mile trip. And the ridership goes up. Higher ridership, higher speeds, and then lower costs. Construction costs, you can see here, $25 million a mile for the light rail. And autonomous rapid transit and BRT, about the same construction costs. It's the same designation of interior lanes, et cetera, and stations. O&M goes way down. It's 50% of light rail and BRT and local buses. And then the fleet cost is higher because it's new technology, all electrified. The beauty, of course, is that when you take and you make a more linear system, the walk shed to that system is expanded. So there's more of the last mile when you have a nimble ART system, even over than BRT. So this is what it looks like. That's just kind of solving the Silicon Valley problem. So I asked my computer guys, let's take urban footprint and look at similar arterials around the Bay Area, and that's what it looks like. So if we were to inhabit all the 6-lane arterials and redevelop all the schlocky commercial along it, we'd have our housing problem and our transportation problem solved. Now, I know everybody knows that there's a huge, gigantic political step between these two, but we have the capability. We have the capability to do the analytics to get from that to that. We can actually look at the impacts on the whole region, and I'll just conclude with a dizzying array of bar charts. Jobs, housing. So here's a scenario for the Bay Area that just says, let's look at compact growth. Land saved, infrastructure saved, VMT saved per household, driving costs, annual savings per household, that's an important number. Building energy, water use, household cost, affordability, even for the middle class, matters these days. Health costs, and greenhouse gas emissions. Stop. I will stop.
Thank you very, very much. Packed full of information and very interesting indeed. So we're going to pick up on those thoughts with an excellent international panel, and I'm going to ask them to please join me on stage, and then I'll introduce you when you are on stage. So for all the panel participants in this fourth plenary, please join me up here. You're going to be in the second to last seat. Your first lady, this is your seat right here next to Peter. And so, exactly, perfect. It is an honor to have with us the First Lady of Costa Rica. She is Claudia Dobles Camargo, and she's an architect and urban planner, and she has worked to develop large-scale projects in her country with a focus on sustainability and on resilience. Great that you can be with us here at Transforming Transportation. Seated next to her is Sophie Punta. She's Executive Director of the Smart Freight Center, which is a Netherlands-based nonprofit that seeks to mobilize freight sector stakeholders to reduce emissions. And next, it's a pleasure to introduce Sri Anurag Sachan. He's Managing Director of the Dedicated Freight Corridor Corporation of India, a state-administered company responsible for an infrastructure project of unprecedented scale, namely establishing dedicated freight corridors across India. Great that you could join us. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Heather Thompson. She's Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, a New York-based NGO that works with policymakers, development banks, other NGOs, and clients to promote sustainable and equitable transport in cities. So I'd like to start out by asking all of you to give me a sense of your take, your response to what we just heard from Peter, but also to those two audience questions that we posed, namely whether AI will solve all our problems or only under certain conditions, and also whether electric vehicles are the answer or only with conditions. And if you want to mention a few of the conditions that you see as imperative, please do so by all means. And I'll start with you, First Lady, and I'm very curious in particular for your response to what we heard from Peter in regard to the importance of planning, urban planning around transport, and how challenging that is to do, particularly in developing countries where the forms of cities are sprawling, not very dense, and where there are significant resource limitations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good morning to everybody. First of all, thank you to the World Bank for this invitation. This is a topic that is priority for Costa Rica. Actually, I would like to start saying very quickly that in Costa Rica we live two different scenarios. The first one is the green Costa Rica, the Costa Rica of the national parks, the Costa Rica that has done a very good job in reforestation, environmental services, the one that is very linked to our country brand. And we have done a very good job on that one, and we are very proud of it. But there's the other one, which is the urban Costa Rica, where we have very poor planification, if non-existent planification. We have very low density, urban sprawl, all the problems that Mr. Calthorpe has touched base in his presentation. And when we were talking about how can we get serious towards our path to decarbonization, we talked about the part that it's already there, the green part, but then we need to tackle one of the biggest problems that we have, which is the transit and urban transportation and public transportation. But it was important when we were having this conversation, because we are launching our national decarbonization plan. We were talking about, okay, if we really want to get serious with this, if we really want to tackle the problem with public transportation, we need to understand how are we planning our cities and how are we going to do to get better in that terms. And we know that it's a political issue as it is a technical issue. On the political side, we only have a limited period of time, and it's very finite, it's very limited. In Costa Rica, we only have a 4-year administration, and for the processes that we really want to do in terms of transportation and urban planning, this is nothing. So we wanted to be realistic on what is the approach that we wanted to take, but also to prioritize the projects that we wanted to do in order for them to catalyze bigger processes. And we reached to the point where we say, okay, we need to prioritize public transportation in 2 projects. The first one is that we have a light rail legacy in Costa Rica that we wanted to take to another level, to go to the to electric train, to a new electric train. We need to put a little bit of sexiness so people go back to public transportation. That in Costa Rica right now it's very inefficient, and it's very linked to, if I cannot have a car, then I have to use public transportation. We need to change that. But we understand that we also need to tackle another different problem, and that is the second project that we have for public transportation, which is to modernize our bus operation. And these 2 projects are, in parallel, as important for us to provide the bigger change. They have both very different challenges. One is more technical, financial. The other one is it's very political, because it's already there, and it's already operating, very ill operate, but it's already operating, and it has a very strong social, political challenges that we want to tackle. But we need to do that in order to do a real transformation, and we understand that. In terms of the light rail, the electric train, Costa Rica has a context that it's very positive, and I believe that we have something that not everybody in the rest of the world has, and it's that we have an electricity matrix that is almost 100% based on renewable energy. So when we are talking about an electric train, a zero-emission train, we are really talking about a zero-emission train. And that is something that we want to do because it's important in the functional part, but it's also important for Costa Rica in the symbolic realm. It is also important because it's a sense of progress in Costa Rica, and we want to build confidence to people. But we are taking, it's interesting of what Mr. Calthorpe was saying, because we're taking the electric train and trying to work with the local governments and provide how can we change the use of land in the corridor that it's going to be influenced by this train? How can we move forward to a more mixed use, to a more community building type of planning? So that is important also to link that with land use and urban planning.
Thank you. You raised so many interesting issues. I'd love to take a deeper dive on a couple of them in our second round, but that's a very, very good overview for us to begin with. Sophie Punta, I would ask you now to also just give us your first response to what we heard from Peter and also to those 2 audience polls. So take it away.
Yeah, I have 3 messages I would like to give. First, there can be no sustainable transport without sustainable freight. And I would love to add a few trucks to your drawings, because I can't imagine a city without delivery either. And if we look at it from a climate perspective or green perspective, the International Transport Forum already found that 46% of global greenhouse transport emissions comes from freight, and soon it will be bigger than transport, so it needs to be included. In China, the biggest single source of air pollution in cities now is transport. The majority comes from freight, so it's gonna come on the agenda one way or the other. So that's one thing, be inclusive of freight and passenger instead of treating them as separate systems. Second, on autonomous vehicles. I think they're going to come because they're sexy, and just like a red Ferrari, everybody would like it. It's going to happen. So it's about how do we make that more sustainable. In trucking, I believe it's going to happen primarily because for an economic reason. If you have laws that require your truck drivers to take pauses after so many hours of driving, whereas autonomous vehicles can keep going, that is such an economic gain and reduction of labor costs that it will just happen. So I think it's not a matter of if it will happen, but how do we manage it? And in that, I would very much like to encourage both researchers as well as policymakers and practitioners include the environmental costs of IT systems and of the production of batteries as well. So I would very much like to know if your calculations for the Bay Area have considered the emissions that comes from the energy that it takes for the IT systems, the computer, the databases, networks to happen. In 2011, it was already found that 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from IT. Yet the IPCC sectors does not include the sector. So if you exclude that, it's not going to work. I would leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. But I do just have one follow-up question, although maybe this is also a follow-up question to Peter. You say that we shouldn't separate the two, but think of passenger and freight transport as integrated. I've seen models that suggest that these little ARTs could be both, that they could perhaps be distributing packages and fresh-baked bread to elderly people and at the same time picking them up to take them to the doctor. Is that a vision that you could imagine being reality one day?
Yeah, I think any inefficiency in a system that can be utilized should be utilized. And the moment that someone can crack the economic model of making it happen, it will happen. And I could imagine that an Uber taxi right now, why couldn't they also carry freight or packages in down periods? So I could very much see that. That's why the integration of the both is, from the outset, is going to be critical in the planning, but also in the execution.
I see Peter nodding, so we'll come to you, Peter, in the end, but I'll just keep going down the panel, first of all. And coming now to you, Mr. Sachan, perhaps also just to begin with a response to what you heard from Peter and also to those two audience polls, and then a little bit later on we'll get to what you're doing at the Dedicated Freight Corridor Company.
Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, World Bank, to invite me here and give me an opportunity to represent my country. It's a really great honor for me. I'll just like to brief you about my country, that is India. We are a nation of 1.3 billion people, and we speak 22 languages in India, and everybody follow a different culture. But it is a united nation. And Indian Railway plays a very, very important, vital role to unify the entire nation. Indian Railway is the fourth largest network in the world with 115,000 kilometers of network. We carry 23 million passengers per day in 22,000 trains. It's a huge task. And besides passenger movement, we carry 1,100 million tons of freight traffic every year. We have 4 metropolitan cities in India. It is known as Golden Quadrilateral. And most of the traffic, whether it is freight or whether it is passenger, it moves in those Golden Quadrilateral. And it carries almost 60% of the total freight traffic of total 1,100 million tons, and 50% of the passenger traffic. So it is totally saturated. Besides this, our economy is growing at a very high rate of 7 to 8% of GDP every year, which is putting a lot of pressure on the transport sector. So it is the requirement of the day that we should do something about the development of the infrastructure. So for solving the problem, we have taken up the work of a dedicated freight corridor so that we can separate freight movement and the passenger movement. So we have planned to construct about 3,000 kilometers of freight corridors on this part of the Golden Quadrilateral so that we can shift the freight traffic from the passenger network. I'm very happy to inform you that we'll be able to complete this year itself about 800 kilometers of double line, fully electrified track on the eastern and western corridor. And we are very hopeful that in next 2 years, we will be able to complete all these 3,000 kilometers of the freight corridor. From the environment side, it will have a very great impact on environment because as per one study, we will be able to save 450 million tons of GHG emission, that is carbon dioxide emission, in next 30 years. And besides this, when freight will start moving on the freight corridors, so our capacity will be available for the passenger services. We can run our passenger services more efficiently, and we can run more services. And at the same time, our roads will get decongested because a lot of traffic from the roads will shift to the railway side and the freight corridors. In fact, in India, we have a share of only 35% freight, which moves on the rail. So this will definitely increase when we'll have a dedicated freight corridor. And it will have a great impact on the passenger safety on the roads, as well as for the environment. That is all I want to say in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll pick up on a couple of those points in our next round of questions. But let me now ask Heather for your initial response to what we heard from Peter and those two audience polls.
Well, I'm going to address the two audience polls, which none of the rest have, which is to say the two questions on AI and electrification. I was not surprised to see that most people say, well, it depends on conditions, right, whether we like this or not. I'm really excited about electrification. I'm really scared about autonomous vehicles for the point that Peter brought up, which is just the phenomena of having zero. I mean, we already have single occupancy vehicles out there way too much, but the idea of having zero occupancy vehicles out there is really, really frightening. But I think the bigger question is, you know, what is technology? Is it a good thing or a bad thing for us in this space? And I think it depends. It depends on the rules that we set for the game. I am really excited about electrification. It's a technology that we've been waiting for many years, but it is here now. For us at ITDP, we're focused on the urban space. All of our work is in the developing world, but we're not focused on passenger vehicles. We're focused on making sure that electrification is truly green and truly efficient, and so we're focused on buses and getting electrification into mass transit, and then also how electrification can bring new interest to person-sized vehicles, as Jarrett Walker was saying yesterday, but small bikes, electric scooters, things that can help use our space a lot more efficiently, because at the end of the day, the space is the limiting factor, as Peter said. In terms of electrification, I mean, the numbers are just increasing astronomically. It's very exciting. I feel like I have to check the stats on a monthly basis. They're going so quickly. But we've reached now more than 4 million electric cars being sold cumulatively across the last decade. But already, just in 2017, there were more than 30 million electric bikes sold. I mean, that is a crazy figure. Buses, we're ramping up quickly. There's already about 300,000 buses on the road, most of which are in China, as we all know. But I think that's the real opportunity. There's many places in the world, Latin America, Costa Rica specifically, where the green is already grid. The grid is already green. And you know, if we can move to electric buses, then they are really zero emissions. But even in the United States, where our grid is mixed, if we move to zero emissions buses, they're half the amount of emissions compared to diesel buses. So that's already a fantastic improvement. But as Peter pointed out, it's, you know, if we have electric or even electric autonomous vehicles sitting in traffic, we haven't done our job, right? They need to move quickly. They need to provide a service that people want. And that really comes down to infrastructure and operations as well. We need segregated lanes so that buses can continue to avoid being in traffic and move quickly. We need to think about the operations, which is not the sexy stuff. It's not technology. It's helping cities. It's helping companies understand how to operate these buses, where to put the depots, how to do contracting, how to do financing. It's these practical, tedious things that are going to be the things that we need to focus on to really make electrification a success.
Thank you. And again, I'll have a couple of follow-up questions for you on that point, but let me go back now to Peter. So Peter, different aspects that have come up. Sophie saying we need to think about freight and passenger transport in an integrated way. Maybe you can speak briefly to that. Sophie also asked to what degree server costs are figured into your calculations. So as we know now, servers also using a tremendous amount of energy, whether that played a role in the overall footprint that you were giving us there. And then well, let's take those two first, and then I have another one.
Well, the freight first. I think, of course, freight has to be part of the nexus, and I think that there are two scales of freight. One is intracity, and one is intercity. And between cities, I think rail freight is clearly superior, although we will have highway trucks, and highway trucks can be AV. You know, I think it's a myth that AV is imminent. The safety issues in complex mixed flow environments and complicated weather patterns, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's deeply involved in the field, it's 20 years away before safety really arrives for those vehicles operating in truly complex environments. Now, 20 years is a long time. On the other hand, those vehicles operating in dedicated lanes that are protected, that is available tomorrow. That's doable. Just as the freight trucks on very clearly marked lanes on freeways is doable tomorrow. So those are the first generation of AV, and hopefully they will be the last generation of AV. And then in terms of the IT energy, all our analytics just look at the change brought about by different kinds of transportation, different kinds of buildings. We have policy levers inside the model that allow you to change the carbon content of the energy, you know, which is a surrogate for electrification of various types and things like that. It doesn't change the base loads that are related to industry and IT and all the rest of that. So there's nothing in our analytics allow us to look at variables there.
Thanks very much. Let me put a question to the First Lady, and then I'll come back to Peter again for a response. So 2 points that piqued my curiosity that I'd love to hear more about. The political challenges that you mentioned surrounding reorienting planning. If you could say a little bit more about that, I'd be very interested. And I'd also be, she has a microphone, thanks. And I'd also be curious to know whether Peter's idea that light rail is very expensive. It's you know, a big planning operation, and that theoretically this ART idea might be more cost effective, and efficiency, of course, is part of our title, our mandate in this panel, might be more cost effective and also more flexible. Whether that resonates with you and whether that is a feasible kind of a vision for a country like yours.
Thank you. First of all, in terms of bus operation and the modernization, right now how it's working, it takes two scenarios to take place in parallel. The first one is the government needs to provide the infrastructure in order for the whole operation be modernized. That will mean prioritized lanes, exclusive corridors, etc. Stations that we actually don't have. So it has to be an investment on infrastructure, which is the easiest part. But the second part is the whole operation needs to be reorganized. And that means that the private sector, they need to reorganize in order to provide a new service, in order to modernize the service. And that means also financial and social challenges for them. And for the people in the communities that they are expecting to see the whole system be improved, but at the same time they don't want to pay the tariffs that maybe they need to pay in order for them to modernize the whole system, because in Costa Rica we don't subsidize the public transportation. Everything goes directly to the tariff. So it's a social challenge in that sense, because on one hand, you need to do the investment. On the other hand, the whole system doesn't provide the government the tools to subsidize the system in order for it to modernize. So it's a political challenge in that sense. In terms of the light rail and the autonomous rapid transit, I do believe that is a reality, and it's going. We are moving forward towards that. That's a reality, and we cannot deny it. It's not the same on how you approach to that and how you plan for that in developing countries than in California. There are completely two different scenarios, two different contexts. And in the case of developing countries in Costa Rica, all that path is very linked to innovation and technology. And the question that I believe developing countries should be doing to themselves is, how can we provide a sense of equality in access to technology? If not, this technology is just going to make a bigger gap, a bigger social gap in our societies, and that will produce bigger problems. So that is something that we really need to take in consideration. Is autonomous rapid transit going to happen? It is going to happen. But I think that in our case, we need to answer more structural social questions prior to get to that point.
Thank you. So, Peter, maybe you can respond to that. And I know you do work internationally. If you're working with developing countries, how would you go about creating the institutional, political, and financial frameworks that can allow for this kind of very difficult transition? We had people on panels yesterday, I don't know if you were here, who were saying stakeholders, vested interests, the difficulty of designing revenue generating public transit that is at the same time equitable, enormous challenges for many developing countries. So how would you go about putting in place the structures that can make that possible?
Well, I have worked in your city, in San Jose, and I looked with great envy at the rail line that you have unused at this point, and thought about how great it could be. It's single track, as I remember. So I would just encourage everybody to think about, if you have the biggest expense is the right-of-way. If you have it, then the next question is, well, what is the most attractive, efficient technology I can put on it? And there is this kind of the old view, which was, well, light rail is, if you've spent the money on dedicated right-of-way, you might as well have high-capacity system. But I do believe that ART represents a new generation that would be just as attractive and equitable and faster and cheaper. So faster and cheaper are always good qualities. In terms of the existing bus system, which is organic and privatized there, which is a wonderful thing, I think the public sector can enhance that by just giving it dedicated right-of-ways, getting them out of the congestion of mixed flow so that anybody who gets on a bus has the advantage of leapfrogging over the existing cars. Maybe some people give up that auto trip if they got there faster. And that's something in the public domain, which is the public owns that geography. And it can spend the geography any way it wants. Now, that's not to pretend that there isn't a huge political controversy about taking lanes away from cars. I mean, it's even impossible to take away free parking from cars in many cases. But in a country like Costa Rica that prides itself on being at the cutting edge of ecological development and existence, this should be a worthy cause. Finally, I'd say the analytics that we're able to do now, that everybody can do, each one of those bar graphs represents a special interest group that right now are pulling independently for their own thing, whether it's land conservation, water conservation, energy, household income savings. Everybody's operating in their stovepipe politically. And the beauty of great urban design is that it creates coalitions. So I think if you present the vision and you back it up with the kind of analytics that allow many groups to see positive outcomes, you get a different political chemistry. And we've experienced that in many places.
Can I have a quick,
Of course, please.
feedback to that? We are working in order, because we are committed to this, and for us, the electric train, as I said, is as important as the bus operation. But the bus operation at the end is going to reach to more people than the train, and we understand that. So last week actually we started the first prioritized lane for bus transportation of 4 that we are going to do this year. So we are doing that. In terms of data analytics, part of the problem that we have in Costa Rica is that we really don't have any data. That's part of the challenge. So we are on parallel working on electronic payment system to try to understand how can we doing baby steps in order to modify a cash completely, right now, 100% cash system to a more controlled system that we could have data. It's not getting out of cash, which is beneficial, but it's more how can we start collecting data in order to start doing analytics based on that. Part of our challenge is that Costa Rica basically we don't have data. That is something that we need to work on.
Thank you very much. So I saw Heather, I think, perking up during some of that, and I want to just give you a chance to react if you had some reaction.
Sure, so many ideas. But I just thought I'd make 2 points, which is first about the cost effectiveness and making sure that governments are really using their money to get the biggest bang for the buck. And as I said before, I'm really excited about electrification, but we see a lot of governments around the world spending their time, their money, their political capital on private passenger vehicles. And if they were looking at that same political capital and how they could spread it amongst the most number of people, they would be focused on bus and mass transportation. So I think governments really need to start thinking about their subsidies, their incentive policies, all of the rest that are oriented around mass transit. The second point is, I think there's been a lot of conversation in the last couple of days of, do we need mass transit? Do we need kind of that backbone? And I'm very happy to hear that I think the majority of us in the audience think that, yes, we do need public transportation and dedicated corridors as the backbone. And I think the footprint analysis that Peter showed us really just emphasizes that. We need transit-oriented development. In order to do that, you need to know where the transit is going to be. But I think electrification and even autonomous vehicles bring a whole new excitement to that. We have been battling the high costs of light rail for decades, but I think with these new technologies, hopefully we can convince governments that buses done with electric technology that are quiet and smooth and bring in Wi-Fi are attractive and allow them to bring in modern services for their people. So just kind of bring new interest to the subject.
So I have spoken to several different European cities who say, we would badly like to do more electric buses. The city where I live, Berlin, says they would order dozens if they could, but they are too expensive, and the bottleneck, the delivery time, is too long. How do we change that? How do we scale up production of what clearly many cities would be very excited about, but at the moment find too expensive and too long lead times?
Yeah, we were supposed to have a woman from BYD on the panel. I would love to have her answer that question, because
that's why you're getting the question.
I don't know if I can answer the question. Increase production. Well, I think the first point of that is it's so exciting, right? For the fact that there are more demand for buses than there are buses available is a good thing, and hopefully production does increase and prices come down. That's really what we need, is more buses out there to bring the prices down. But you know, over the lifetime of the bus, an electric bus is actually cheaper. It's more expensive up front. There's a higher capital cost, but the operations over time are lower. There's lower maintenance, the fuel, the operations are much simpler. So it's just changing the finance models, which of course there's lots of folks here from development banks. So it's changing those financial models so that you can have that upfront capital cost. And there are new structures. There are battery leasing models. There are other ways in which you can essentially pay for the battery over the lifetime of the use. So I think trying to continue to innovate with these financing structures, test them out, making sure that cities and countries that are signing up for these finance schemes truly understand them and can commit to them, because I think we are seeing some issues where cities don't quite understand what they're signing up for, and that's where organizations like mine can really help provide advice to cities when they're making these deals.
Sophie, please.
Yeah, I wanted to add an example from the trucking sector, because I know that both BYD and Tesla are looking for trucking to leasing models, because of course a truck is even bigger than a bus and more expensive, and the sector is has very tight margins. This has two advantages. Actually three advantages. One is that you pay for the truck but not for the battery, because you lease it. And as a result, the upfront costs are much lower. Second, and I could imagine the same would apply to buses, because the battery is not owned by you, but by the manufacturer, the manufacturer will not conveniently construct it in a way that it breaks down after 10 years, to sell another one, but has every incentive to make this last for 30 years. And if we know about the environmental impact of just making batteries, let alone recycling, it is in all our interest to set up these leasing models for long-term sustainability. And thirdly, I think if city governments, which actually same applies to road freight operators, do not have the technical knowledge to even know exactly what they're getting into with batteries. By having a leasing model, you put the ownership or the responsibility with the supplier to make sure that it runs. So in your contracts, you can also make sure that there's a way of that they make sure that those buses keep running, are maintained. So I think there's multiple benefits of moving to leasing models, and I think at the moment they're under-researched.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sachan, staying with the question of freight transport, and you talked about your assumption that there will be a road-to-rail shift as you build the dedicated freight corridors. Can you be sure of that in view of the fact that many shippers are now looking at these new technologies like autonomous trucking as a very cost-effective and flexible way to transport freight? And if you remain confident, what kind of pricing models will the government be using in order to make sure that that road-to-rail shift really does occur?
Yeah. See, as per the study in India, if any lead goes beyond 300 to 400 kilometers, or you can say 250 miles, the transport by rail is much cheaper. And whatever dedicated freight corridor we are creating, it is completely electrified. It is having a current of 2 into 25 kVA. And one train will carry 13,000 tons of load, which is equivalent to 1,300 trucks, standard trucks. So you can just imagine that if we are creating 120 paths in freight corridors and fully electrified, so we'll be removing 120 into 1,300 trucks from the roads. So you can imagine what, and it is, the speed of, average speed is very, very high compared to the present speed of 25 miles per hour. We'll be carrying the freight at the speed of 65 miles per hour. So I'm sure that with the great efficiency of electrification and the speed, we'll be able to address the problem of the freight rates. Rates will definitely come down, and if we reduce the rates, the share of rail share will definitely increase from 35% to say 40%.
Sophie Punta, I'd like to get you to perhaps think a little bit about the dedicated freight corridor project in India and the overall ramification, also in terms of our discussion here, which talks about the need for systemic and integrated approaches. But beyond that, I'd also like to ask you, because I'm seeing some time warnings here, and we do want to get to audience questions, to talk a little bit about new mobility technologies and models and how they are permitting better matching of supply and demand in freight, and including, of course, then also shipping. So two big subjects, but I'll just hand them on to you and see what you can do with them in a short amount of time.
Okay. I'll start with the first one briefly. I think that the development of dedicated freight corridors like you see in India is fantastic. And I know also that World Bank, for example, has been involved in, from Delhi to Calcutta, to look at both the waterways and the rail and the road as an integrated system to make sure that freight could be placed on the right mode, which I think is a very systematic thinking, and I compliment you on that. In China, what we see is that because of the huge investment in high-speed passenger rail, the old railway system, if you like, has become free. And the China government has now said, we want 75 of long-distance road freight to go to rail. So you can imagine, because they see the spare capacity there, it's government-owned, they see also a source of keeping that economically alive, and so the freight sector just has to comply and work with that. So that's one side. The one that I really wanted to talk about is the freight and demand supply chain. I don't know if any of you have heard of freight exchange platforms, but it's basically a term that's talking about the Uberization of freight. It's like a dating site. So you're a shipper like an IKEA, Heineken, a Unilever, and you want goods to be transported from A to B. And instead of looking for your own carriers to do that, you go to a platform and then you have different carriers bid for your load. And by doing that, you have access to many more carriers and it's cheaper. Yeah. And we see various of these platforms happening. It's Coyote in the US, 123 Cargo in Europe, G7 in China. And or it's the other way around, and there's a small one called Joint Cargo in Greece, which is very neat. They get trucking companies who say, I've still got some space in my truck and I'm driving from Athens to Amsterdam anyway, who wants it? But the principle is dating. Now, that is amounting to reduced empty miles. And reduced empty miles reduces CO2. So in any case, it's going to help us with carbon efficiency. The beauty of the model is that I met one of the CEOs of one of these platforms in China called Earth Meets Sky. And he explained the cost for the customer is 20% less. The number of trips and kilometers driven, in other words, the use of a truck for the carrier is 40% more. Yeah? But now comes the beauty. It is not just the empty miles that they're reducing, but it's because this platform, like G7, has 800,000 trucks connected to it. That's almost 5% of the Chinese trucking population and growing. They have the ability to get fuel data, to get engine data, to get driver information, and as a result provide a platform to give exactly the data that you were mentioning, but also to create a way to innovate the sector. Through G7, 11% of fuel was reduced because of better tires, because of driver training, because of aerodynamics. So these platforms do not only provide a way of reducing costs, they also provide a way of innovating the sector. And I'm frankly baffled, because I went to all the website last night to have a look, that very minimum information of the carbon reduction potential that these platforms could provide. And whichever platform is able to capture that business case, they will be the winner in a future carbon-constrained world, because we're going to see carbon limits put on companies, including those multinationals I just mentioned. So I think it's a huge potential.
Thank you very much. I have another audience poll that I would like to do and then get a brief reaction before we open to audience questions. So the poll is this. Please, once again, go to our URL, pollsev.com/TT19, I think it was. And then we have the question for you, and it's basically a word cloud question. Use one word to describe a key condition for new mobility solutions to deliver efficiency and green results. So one word, whatever you think is most important for that to happen. Fake news, that's interesting. So regulation, policy, pricing, right there at the center. In other words, not going to be technology driven or not directly, but very much, and this of course was something that came out of so many of our decisions, of our discussions yesterday as well, that those structures, those enabling frameworks, policy frameworks, institutional frameworks, cooperation frameworks, including public-private, are so crucial. So let me perhaps go back across the panel one more time to get all of you to address that piece of it. Data is now coming up as a bigger factor there, which is, of course, something that several of you have also addressed. But let's talk a little bit about that enabling framework, regulatory, institutional side. So I'll start with you, First Lady, and maybe just a very quick take from all of you on that, and then we're going to go to audience questions.
Well, I think in Costa Rican case, and I believe this might be a position where a lot of cities and countries shared, is that our social dynamics are moving so much faster than our regulatory system can move. And that is a huge challenge for the government and for the decision makers, because we know that we are moving forward autonomous vehicles. How the regulatory system must change and adapt in order to that happen. And that is something that it's a huge challenge, and I think that we need to rethink the way that we are making public policy, to make it efficient and to make it faster in order to provide the answers to the citizenship as fast as the society needs.
Sophie Punta, when I introduced you, I said that your organization is dedicated to mobilizing action. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that in this context. What are the most crucial levers that you can use to mobilize action, also from the private sector?
We are working with companies quite closely. We're finding 5 areas they would use: energy, the fleets, the logistics movement, the modes, and the freight demand. All the solutions exist. It's about scaling. And in a world where the markets and big companies are increasingly powerful, it is critical that governments don't try to overregulate everything, but rather set clear boundaries around what's possible and standardize stuff. Can we please have one plug for plugging in electric? Can we have, please, one protocol for data exchange? And coming to that, where our role then is that we, as Smart Freight Center, we started by realizing that without transparency, there's no action. So we work together with industry to develop one method for calculating logistics emissions across all modes, called the GLEC framework. And then we worked with development banks to create a similar method applied to corridors, like freight corridors. And my dream is that this is extended to policy, so that in the future, when decisions are made around what actions are needed and which are most effective, that the data that business, policymakers, development banks and others are using the same underlying methodology. The actions are there, it's about scaling, and my key word, which I didn't see, but I'm sure that it's hidden in there, is collaboration. We're not going to make it unless we think in an ecosystem, unless we work together. And at the moment, there's still a lot of isolated, fragmented efforts. And I suppose what I try to do at Smart Freight Center is help companies particularly navigate the landscape of initiatives and find out what's most effective so we can go faster and go to scale.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sachan, perhaps a word from you both on the governance and regulation frameworks that are important for you in terms of creating the enabling environment for this breathtaking project, but also where the challenges lie.
See, in fact, we are creating huge capacity for the freight transportation. So we have decided that we will involve private players to set up multimodal logistic parks. And also, we have planned that private operators will help us in operation and maintenance and to bring back the technology. So, and our regulator has allowed us to do this. So, in India, for the first time, because Indian Railway is managed by the government, but dedicated freight corridor will have a full regulation from the government, but we are allowed to give a lot of work to the private players. And I'm sure the involvement of private player will get us the efficiency, and the prices will be reduced and will be more competitive.
Thanks very much. Heather?
I was very excited to see that one of the keywords was pricing, which pricing only happens if you have policy and regulation, so they're all related. But I think in the urban context, we're seeing a renewed interest in congestion charging. And there is a lot of technology available now that means that we can do congestion charging in a new way than we've done before, where we had to depend on license plate schemes that we know ultimately got gamed. People would just buy new cars. But now we have camera-based systems that can use very simple technology, advanced but simple to implement technology to enforce things like congestion charging. But beyond just focusing on congestion, we can focus on things like occupancy or size of vehicles. So we can get a lot more sophisticated so that ultimately we are driving the charging so that we are having more people in our vehicles operating in different places even within the city. Having zones that are complete zero emission zones where only green vehicles are allowed, whereas maybe other corridors that are based on other models, maybe it's occupancy and not so much the technology of the vehicles themselves. So I'm really excited about it. I know it's politically fraught, but we are seeing more and more cities that are actually dealing with so much congestion that they're looking for new ideas, and there's a whole new conversation happening around congestion charging and the like that I'm really excited about.
Thanks very much. And one very quick last word from Peter, perhaps, in regard to that. What is the most crucial of those factors in your view, the most crucial lever there?
I was depressed that TOD got almost no standing in that image. I think consensus is about coalition building. And I think that the easiest way to build coalitions is to stop operating as people who are transportation and transit operators and or thinkers, and start thinking in terms of whole systems. And the more whole systems thinking we have, the more integration we have. I mean, just listening to you two here made me start to think of all the moribund track in the United States that really could be shared with passenger. I know in other parts of the world it's the reverse. The passengers overwhelm the right-of-ways and the freight has nowhere to go. But in other parts of the world, can't we use smart technology to allow more passenger movement? None of us talked about airplanes and the profound impact that's having on the environment. So whole systems thinking, I think, is really at the heart of it, because it gets to the politics and the economics.
Thank you very much. I think everybody got the TOD message, but maybe not everybody got the acronym. That could be the reason for that. So we have some audience questions back at the mic, and if I could ask for shortish questions, that would be great, so we have a chance to really get some responses.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. My name is Seth. I'm with the World Resources Institute. This question is for Mr. Peter Calthorpe. It's great to see a land use expert in the room. I commend you for coming here. In a way, you're kind of in the lion's den, because this is transforming transportation, not transforming land use. The question I have for you, it's regarding, I want to hear your views on a certain special interest group that we've yet to touch on, and I think they are the X factor when it comes to our universe of urban development, and that's developers. That they are the ones ultimately, when it comes down to it, making these decisions when it comes to what's going to be built. When it comes to infill, the cities can set the agenda, they could do the coding and zoning, but the developers, they're the ones that are doing the financing and doing the construction. So I want to hear your views on that, and what innovative ways the cities we work in to better engage with that group. And then just lastly, your acronym ART, I think that's great. I like the Autonomous Rapid Transit. And let's just go ahead and call it ART. We have enough acronyms at this point, so just go ahead, call it ART. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Peter, I'm going to take a couple of questions and then bundle. So next question, please.
Thank you. I'm Arturo, Global Lead here at the World Bank. For Peter, Claudia, and Heather on TOD, aren't cities over-regulated when it comes to land use? When we talk about TOD, aren't we really meaning deregulate a little bit some spaces in the urban area so that higher density, mixed land use, and better design space can emerge? Aren't we pricing out the poor with hyper-regulation of cities? San Jose tends to be empty at night because it's an empty city that during the day has lots of people that flock in, but land use. What can we do to change land use? Here at the World Bank, they tell us your mass transit investment, World Bank, generated gentrification. I answered no. It's the land use hyper-regulation that is capping artificially supply. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, hello. I'm Armin Gould. I come from an automotive and consumer research background. I was curious to get the panel's impressions and hopefully experience about feeding all of the vehicles from two-wheelers up to 18-wheelers into Internet of Things and utilizing that to optimize the flow of people, goods, and services, especially in the emerging markets.
Okay. One more.
Hello, good morning. Marcelo Schneider from BYD. So I would like to help Heather a little bit with the answer of the other question. So to reduce the lead time, we already have factories in USA, in Brazil, and also in Europe. So we can do this. And then with good practice, with green policies, we can improve more e-bus, e-taxis, e-cars, and also other ways. I just want to share two models that we have. The one is in Chile, Santiago, Chile. We have delivered 100 electric buses there, and Enel, the energy company, bought these buses and then they leased to the bus operator. This is a good case for this kind of operation. And in Campinas, a city near São Paulo in Brazil, a new tender will open now in March. And then they will create a white area. In this white area, downtown, only electric buses will allow to run. So this is a way to push bus operators to buy electric buses. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So let's let that stand as a comment statement. And I will now pass around those questions. Peter, maybe you want to start with the developers' question and their role, and then talk about whether you agree with the fact that we have hyper-regulation over regulated cities.
I actually think the developers had turned a corner in 2008. The collapse of real estate values in the United States was really a sign of the fact that we had built too much single-family, large lot housing. It wasn't affordable, and it didn't match the demographics. It was inertia that drove us to it, and out-of-dated zoning and backward-looking financing. Most developers now, represented by the ULI, are all for infill and mixed use. And actually, the developers in San Jose that I encountered were all for infill and mixed use. And transit accessibility now has become a primary selling point for all kinds of development, housing and jobs. There's no issue on any of that. The biggest roadblock is NIMBYism, is the neighborhoods that are afraid of change and afraid of infill.
Let's just remind the audience in case,
okay,
not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard, which is people with their own real estate values wanting to keep other development away so that they have a stable real estate environment. As for, what was the second part?
Hyperregulation of cities, whether cities aren't actually over-regulated.
That feeds into the NIMBY problem, which is because, at least in the United States, zoning is always local. In most parts of the world, it is. The existing citizens control the future, and they typically don't want growth. So therein lies the systemic problem we have with the land use component of all this. There are many places that are against transit because they see it as growth-inducing. I've encountered many political barriers because of that. But I think the real goal here is to plan comprehensively for the future. Too many transit agencies are looking to satisfy the existing conditions, not create the framework and the catalyst for future development. You know, transit is the catalyst. When the United States built its interstate highway system, it catalyzed 2 generations, 3 generations of land use patterns. We need to do the same with transit. Transit needs to lead development, not follow development.
Okay, many thanks. Maybe, First Lady, you want to add something on hyper-regulated cities?
I think Costa Rica it's over-regulated in most of its sectors, but land use is one of the exceptions. It's old-fashioned regulated, if regulated. In Costa Rica, the central government provides the national land use regulations, but it's very, very general. And then the local government needs to provide the specific land use regulation through what we call Plan Regulador, regulating plan. Most of our territory doesn't have a regulatory plan. They just don't have it. So in our case, it's not hyper-regulated. In the few cases where we do have land use regulations, the model, it just doesn't represent our reality. The model that it used to be in Costa Rica was a single-used land use plan. So we had housing on one side and we have industry on the other hand. Most of the regulations doesn't allow us to start using more and more mixed-use developments. There's a few areas and a few legal gaps where we can put mixed use, but actually our own regulation limits us in order to do more mixed use, a little bit more strategic densify our cities. So I do believe that we cannot over-regulate because we've seen that we suffered from that in other sectors. We need to provide a more flexible framework, but also, again, this is one of the cases we need to rethink lawmaking and how we provide policy making to make it more faster and to make it more flexible, to make civil participation so we can change it quicker in order to how can we give response to the social dynamic. But no, in Costa Rica, land use is not over-regulated.
Okay. Heather, I think that question was also addressed to you, so if you have any thoughts to add, please do.
Yeah, I would just say I think in some markets it's very overregulated and others it's not, and things are just messy because there's no regulation. I think one of the things we can really focus on, which has been touched upon, is the placement of affordable housing. A lot of governments are focusing on the need for affordable housing and subsidizing that, so it's a huge opportunity, and making sure that that housing is placed near transit is going to bring a wealth of benefits. So that's one place to really focus on. Maybe it's not regulation, it's more decision making, but getting that alignment.
Thank you very much. And Sophie, you had the question, or there was a question about the Internet of Things as a means of sort of bundling all different aspects of freight. So perhaps you want to speak to that.
I think it's all about system interconnection, and because goods don't have the NIMBY syndrome, if you like, it's I think much better. I actually think also that passenger transport can learn a lot from the freight sector, because the freight sector in a way is a safer environment to test some of these concepts, because you don't have to deal with people as much. The one comment I wanted to make about over-regulation is that at the moment, I would just ask, can especially urban regulation include freight? Urban planning guys in China do not even consider freight because it's considered a national thing, not a city thing. You have industry, commercial, residential, land allocation, which is not possible for freight. So in Beijing alone, you have more than 40 illegal or unofficial logistics sites sprawled around the city. Out of the 1,000 cities worldwide with more than 500,000 citizens, only about 25 we found so far have urban freight plans. Berlin is one of them. And the moment you forget in the regulation, the planning, the freight side, you clean up one side of the room and you make a mess in the other side, and that's not going to work. So I plead for more regulation instead of for freight at least, instead of just banning trucks because they're a nuisance. They need to be thought part of the system.
I see Mr. Sechan nodding, so I really can't resist asking you about that last mile. I realize you're responsible for the corridor, but to what degree is the planning of what happens to the freight once it leaves the corridor part of your overall approach? Do you have a systems approach in that respect?
Yeah, we are doing. We are doing aggressive marketing for developing the freight corridor, and we want that maximum traffic should come on the corridor so that we can free our road system and we can free our cities. So we are providing connectivity to all the ports. We are developing new ports and different goods sheds and multimodal logistic hubs. So this is dedicated freight corridor is like an artery, and we are providing connections and we are involving the private players. So this will become a very efficient system. So I'm sure that if any country wants to develop, they have to really take care of the freight, because it's very, very important for the environment and as far as for the providing the capacity. So I think we are going in the right direction, and within 2-3 years, we'll complete this project, and I'm sure that this will be a game changer for our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that brings our discussion to a close. Many thanks to our panel. Let's give them a warm round of applause.